For you tonight, we have Dr. Jim Harris. He is the owner of Opportunities Consulting Services and the Associate Director of the West Virginia Autism Training Center at Marshall University. He has had several roles in the health and human services field throughout his career as an early interventionist, parent educator, educational consultant, university professor, and behavioral health therapist. Dr. Harris has presented a variety of conferences from the local and the international levels on such topics as behavioral intervention, parenting, positive behavior support, trauma-informed care, organizational change, and many more. He is the creator of 10 Things You Need to Know About Kids, an audio program that helps parents and teachers be more effective in their work with children. And he has also worked with a variety of public and private critics, including the Fred Rogers Company, the United States Department of Education, and the United States Department of Justice, and many more. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. Tonight we welcome Jim Harris, and we're just going to go ahead and get started here. So Jim, how about giving us an insight about you and your experiences?
Okay. Well, right now I have a couple different things that I do primarily. I own Opportunities Consulting Services, which is a company that I own where I do a lot of behavioral consultation and behavior training, a lot of times with education, but also with like residential centers and correctional facilities and companies in general. So I have that part of the work I do. And I'm also the associate director of the Autism Training Center at Marshall University. So those are my two primary roles now. My background, my bachelor's and master's are in social work. So I had that mental health background, but my doctorate's in education. So a lot of my work has centered around kind of the blending of the clinical world and the educational world. And I've done different positions that kind of work toward that with like positions around, like I was a private practice therapist, worked in community mental health, helped start some school-based mental health programs, taught in some different programs. So, but kind of the apex of my work has been working a lot with mental health and behavior as it relates to education.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us into the conversation we're going to have tonight about antisocial discipline strategies. Sure. So I was wondering if you could give us some information on maybe why timeout, detention, suspension, and expulsions, maybe why that's not the best strategy to use for discipline.
Well, I just think, that's why I'm glad you kind of reached out to me about us having this conversation. I think this is just something in education we just need to be having a more thoughtful dialogue around. I think, we've used antisocial discipline strategies as a primary response. I've seen a lot of places use antisocial discipline strategies as a primary response for challenging behavior, but I just don't know if that's the most effective strategy for a lot of our kids. So what I'm trying to get folks to do is kind of take a closer look at what kids need from us today. So an antisocial discipline strategy, just so people don't feel like I'm using semantics, it really is anytime you remove a child from a social setting, like the classroom, the school, wherever it might be, when you remove them, that by definition is antisocial because it's not social, so we're removing it. So a pro-social environment is going to be programming in the school, those kinds of things. So any kind of response to challenging behavior that I'm using that removes them from that environment, by definition, is antisocial. So I don't want people to think I'm just creating some new psychological buzzword. So one of the things that I think is important to think about is if the challenging behavior, the goal has to be then, I would think, to create growth, behavioral growth. We want that kid to be better. We want that kid to learn new skills. And part of the problem is, like, take, for example, timeout. In its original inception, timeout's not a bad strategy for certain kids. Because here's what it was for. When a child's in a situation and they're causing disruption to themselves or others or the environment, you remove that child from the programming so more harm isn't done or something, so you kind of lessen the risk of that situation. But then after you do that, and this is where I think we've lost track with some of our strategies. This is kind of a golden rule for me that I think principals, teachers, anybody working in education, even parents, I think, need to think about is anytime a child's behavior gets so challenging they have to remove them from an environment, I should always ask myself two key questions. And the first question is, what skills did that child lack that kept them from being successful in that situation? And is there anything I can change about the environment of that situation that's going to help that kid be successful in the future? I mean, you know, Paul, we have some situations where if we could just tweak what we're doing in the environment, you know, we have kids that can perform better if we just provide more supports in that environment. So if I remove a child from any kind of pro-social situation using an antisocial strategy, then I have to circle back and say, what skills did that child lack? And then what can I change about that environment that will help that kid be successful in the future? Where that falls short is when we take that 6-year-old kid and then he sits and we say, go sit over there and think about what you've done. And how many 6-year-olds do you know are sitting over there like thinking about their thinking, which is developmentally inappropriate anyways, but they're over there like sitting in that chair going, you know what, you know, I've really got to think about my life. If I'm gonna make something myself, you know, I'm glad I've had this time to reflect on my life. Like very few kids are over there thinking about what they've done and creating strategy for what they could do better in the future. So, so how do we expect growth from that, behavioral growth from like that small example? You know, that we need to then circle back and say, what do we need to do for skill development and environmental change? So that's a small example of how sometimes we think just that removal. You know, one of the things I tell people is isolation does not stimulate. You know, so when you isolate a human being by neurological function, you can't stimulate neurology. And the stimulation of neurology is learning. So I can't expect that isolation in and of itself to be a highly effective strategy. Now, I will say this in fairness. There are some kids who are very pro-social that when they miss out on a pro-social activity, it will cause behavioral change. Like I'm sure you've worked with kids before that like, just like they're so social, they want to be a part of things. If they miss out on something that is really fun to them, like, and here's how you can tell if that works with a kid. The behavior that they're getting punished for goes away or goes down. But when we have kids, like high schools are notorious for this, we'll have a kid spend the whole year in detention. And it's like, well, but what else are we doing? Well, you know, he hasn't learned, so he's going to sit in detention. But, I mean, that's just the expression of insanity. You know, we got this kid sitting in detention all year. We're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting something new to happen. So, you can go on for days about that stuff. But I don't know I'm sure you've seen some of that in your work, too, in education. But, you know, this thinking of you go sit in that room or you go be miserable, and you're going to be so miserable that you'll never do that behavior again. And if that was true, then we would eliminate behaviors with those types of strategies. But I see some of our kids that even getting worse in some instances, you know, and that's not even going down the road to things like suspension and expulsion. You know, I don't know. I mean, and we can go more into those kinds of things, but that's something I think we should be really analyzing the effectiveness of those antisocial strategies in that situation.
Yeah, definitely. You know, one of my favorite quotes says that, you know, if a kid doesn't know how to read, so we teach them how to read. And if they don't know how to add, we teach them the mathematics. Right. But if the kid doesn't know how to behave, we typically just put them in suspension or timeout, detention. And so, you know, that's why we need to have we need to start that conversation. You know, what are we going to do about teaching behaviors in addition to the academics?
And I think it's interesting. What I see a lot, Paul, is people view behavior differently. They view behavior as a moral deficit and oftentimes view academics as a skill deficit. You know what I mean? So, like, if you act up behaviorally, then that's something morally wrong, or, you know, it's choice and value based. But if a kid doesn't know how to do something academically, we automatically assume that's a skill deficit. And I think until we start to view behavior and academics both as developmental skills, people won't have the type of thinking that needs to get them in a place to provide those supports. And like you said, teaching behavior, like that unfortunately, that's a somewhat uncommon phrase that when we say teaching behavior, people are like, well, what? And a lot of people get in trouble thinking, oh, well, he should know how to do this and he should know how to do that. And I just say, what's his behavior telling him? Or telling you does his behavior tell you that he knows how to do these things? So, you know, I think that's a important discussion. And you know, if we take it out a little further, just one of the things I tell people, take it out to the edge. We take it out a little further. Start looking at, you know, we talk about school violence. big topic right now, obviously. Unfortunately, it's a big topic in education, where we're talking about things, like school shootings and risk assessments and those kinds of things. You go back and look at some of the stuff with the Secret Service response and a report after Columbine and the FBI's work after that, and you go and look at one of their key risk factors for a kid, and one of the things they're going to identify is they're looking for if a kid is socially connected with the school. So they're going to look at things like, what's your peer group like? And then you go investigate the kid's peer group. Are they a pro-social group of kids? They don't have to be all Rhodes Scholars, but just good kids, generally good kids, pro-social kids. Tell me if you have at least one staff member in that building where you feel confident sharing a problem with them comfortably. And the third one is, do you participate in school community activities? Do you go to dances? Do you go to the parties? Do you go to football games? Things like that. And what you're trying to get a feel for when you're asking kids those questions is, are they socially connected to the school community? So if you get, yes, I have good friends. Yes, I have good relationships with teachers. Yes, I participate in school community activities. Now that kid feels like he's a part of us. And us, because we're social creatures, us is, we take care of us. But if I have a kid who doesn't have a good peer group, or doesn't have peers or very many peers at all, feels disconnected from staff and feels disconnected from the school community, well, now the school community has become them. And I'm sure you've seen kids like this, that they're on the outside looking in. And you don't have to take too close a look at history to understand that the most dangerous arrangement in a social structure is when you have two separate groups that believe they're so different from one another that they don't care about them anymore. If you look at like American slavery, you look at the Holocaust, the perpetrating group didn't view the group that they were perpetrating against as the same as them or part of an us, so that they didn't have a sense of empathy or connection with that inside group. Well, and you might say, well, how does that connect with suspension and expulsion? If I already have a kid who has antisocial tendencies, and of course, before 18, you can't diagnose them with antisocial personality disorder, but if they're already showing disconnect, if they're already showing a separation from the group, and I use my primary strategy on a child that has antisocial characteristics is to use an antisocial discipline strategy. You don't have to, logic would tell you you're going to make him worse. So I don't know. That's something I think, it's do no harm. And I think in some instances we got to look at what we're doing with that.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of times that, if we rely on out of school suspension, a lot of times kids just like that, and they would prefer to have that. I had one young man who was going on either a 1 or 2 day out of school suspension that butted right up with the weekend, and he stood up and he said, "Thanks for the vacation," and he just walked out of the room.
Yeah.
And at that point, and I recognized that in the past, but I felt like that was what he wanted at that point. He didn't want to come to school. He didn't want to be around us, and
right.
And he was just happy to be out there on his own.
I'll tell you a good place to start, though, Paul, for like a lot of administrators and teachers and leadership teams and buildings, is to look into their school data and first make sure that they're not suspending because there are things that kids need to be suspended for. There are things that are safety risks. There are things that the school needs to huddle up, and the district might need to look at what resources and what kind of placements might better serve the student and the safety of the other students and the safety of the student. Like, I don't want anybody to mistake that I'm not saying that those situations don't occur. They absolutely do. But you have to differentiate between a true school threat or a safety violation and what is called chronic behavioral infractions. So I've got a kid who smarted off to a teacher in first period on Monday, was caught wandering the halls on Tuesday, and then displayed affection in the hallway on Wednesday. Goes to the principal's office 3 days in a row, and the principal goes, "You know what? I'm tired of it. You've been in my office 3 days this week. You're suspended for 3 days." So now if you look at each one of those offenses, none of them are suspendable offenses by if you look at level infractions, none of them alone would be a suspendable offense. So, but now I've just increased my intervention to the highest level intervention I have on a non-suspendable offense. So those are the ones that I think school teams, teachers, administrators could start with. Like, they'll say, well, this Harris guy's a little over the top with some of this stuff, but they could at least start and say, well, let's take a look and see if we are suspending for things that are not suspendable offenses just because, and if we're fair about it, people are honest about it, a lot of times it's just because we're tired of them. I mean, it's like, I'm tired of hearing so that's where we have to have better behavior support systems as a whole. Like that kid, just suspending them is not going to fix them. But so we have to take a bigger picture of what behavior support looks like in our schools. But using systems like a multi-tiered system, positive behavior support, things like that.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us right into the next question. What are some approaches some schools that you work with, or some examples that you know to be effective that are useful for modifying student behaviors to reduce the use of antisocial discipline strategies?
Yeah, first, I think when I'm working with schools and I'm working in whether it be around here or all over the country, the first thing I think is important when I'm working with schools is they have to first start to assess whether use of antisocial discipline strategies is a problem for them. So you start with, because you got to, you know how this is with educational initiatives. It's kind of how the wind blows sometimes. Like, oh, it's the new thing, So I'm always careful that people that they got to want to change some things before you start giving strategies. You know what I mean? Like Tony Robbins. I know everybody knows who Tony Robbins is, right? He talks about, like, you have your state, which is where you are emotionally and physically, and you have your story, which is what you're telling yourself about that situation, and then you have strategies, which is what you're going to do to improve your situation. Sometimes when working with schools, what we have to do is to start talking about having a better, like, really getting a clear story about what's happening in their building. Because if not, people will be like, well, we're not doing anything wrong, just kids are worse today. I would say the kids have more needs than they've had historically. I think kids are showing up in schools with more needs. I don't think it's a big group of kids that are plotting against schools. I think kids are showing up doing the best they can with what they have. And I think we have to view that differently, as opposed to, people say, well, so what's wrong with kids these days? The reframe to that for me is, what do kids need from us today? And I think kids need a better behavior support systems in schools than have ever been required than before. And that doesn't, it just, times change. We know that. It's not 1950, 60, or even 1980 or 2000 anymore. We have kids that need more comprehensive behavior support systems. So I start with, can schools start to explore, this is something schools don't need to hire some big, high dollar consultant to come in or whatever it might be. Start looking at your discipline data, start looking at your antisocial discipline strategies, what you're suspending for, and that kind of stuff. And then once people identify, hey, you know what, I think we got an issue. My main theoretical background in my research and my dissertation was on school-wide positive behavior support. So school-wide positive behavior support is the most evidence-based, and I know it's a junk word sometimes, but it is truly the most evidence-based behavior support system in education. And I don't take my word for it. People need to read up on that stuff. Go to a place like pbs.org, go to your EBSCO, get your peer-reviewed journals, look into that, because there's a lot of cute things out there. There's a lot of cute, like, you buy this curriculum for $799.95, and they give you a DVD and a facilitator guide that's going to fix all your bullying problems and all this stuff. But, complicated problems need complicated solutions. And PBIS is what it's that multi-tiered model, RTI based, MTSS, that kind of stuff, where we're looking at a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 level of intervention. So I think that's where you have to respond in a comprehensive way. What happens is people think, well, this guy's telling us we can't suspend kids anymore. What are we going to do? And my answer to that is, it's a systems change. It's not going to be overnight, and it's going to be hard. I mean, because nothing worth it is easy. So, I don't know. But so PBIS is school-wide PBIS, in my opinion, is a great first step for a school as far as to organize their interventions. And I can, if I can give more detail about that stuff if needed. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I know that when you start talking about reducing the number of suspensions, people think that we're just, it just won't ever be used. And I'm glad that you touched on it earlier, that there is a time and a place for it. But,
yeah, absolutely.
And they think that, instead of just suspending a student, that the student just kind of walks away with no consequence at all. But
that's right.
Like you said, a complete systems change where, that's not the only thing you do. What you do is you start from the very beginning with your PBIS model, and
Right.
you just go from there. I know that a couple of schools I worked with over the last few years have implemented some PBIS strategies, and one of them was just sending home positive notes for kids. And so I remember one boy I worked with rarely got any positive feedback ever, just because of behavior, just because of grades. And I remember I had written him a positive note, and he'd done something, and it's not like he had a great week, and maybe he didn't even have a great day, but he had like a great 10 or 15 minutes. And so I wrote him a note on that one, and for 2 weeks I saw that note stuck on the inside of his binder. He had it slid in that cubby right there on the inside of the binder, and he carried the thing around, and he was so proud of that thing. And you could tell he was just a little bit here and there. We had wrote him as a team. We'd wrote him some more throughout the year, and you did see change. I mean, it wasn't overnight. It wasn't over a month. I mean, but over the course of a year, you did see change in the young men and a lot of the students that we worked with.
I think when you look at behavior support systems, like what I'm trying to help people understand a lot of times is we need to reframe. Like, people talk about a discipline system, which oftentimes when they talk about their discipline policy, they're talking about their punishment policy. So if you do this, this is what we're going to do to you. That's what a lot of times a discipline policy is. It's a punishment policy. Like, you make this infraction, we're going to get you, that kind of thing. But I think a true behavior support system, just off the top of my head, I'm walking into a school, I'm going to say, hey, do you have a group of people who meet to talk about your behavioral issues in your school at least monthly? If they say, yeah, does that team actually look at your discipline data? Because same thing we would look at for like literacy, math, whatever. We would of course look at that data, because we know now that, like, obviously if you want to have more effective interventions, you got to know where to focus your work. So do we have a team that meets? Do we talk about data in those meetings? Do we have, and this is the big thing that's huge, do we have school-wide expectations for all people in all environments? Like, has our staff got together and decided what are our key expectations for our students in our building? So like a real common one in the PBIS model would be like, be safe, be respectful, be responsible. So have we decided as the adults first what it means to be safe in our hallways? Or does it depend on which adults in the hallway on what the expectation is? And you've seen that, I'm sure. Like, one teacher's in the hallway, they're correcting kids for one thing, and other kids in the hallway, that's okay. So we start with, all right, let's get on the same page about what the expectations are in our building. And that's really the hardest part a lot of times, is getting all the adults to agree on what our expectations. And then once we decide on those expectations, now we got to talk about how we're going to teach them. Now we got to talk about how we're going to teach kids how to be successful in our hallways. How we're going to teach kids how to be successful at morning and at transitions. And then after that, and this is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about PBIS, they think that PBIS is all about rewards. Absolutely not. It's teaming, data, expectations, teaching expectations, and then feedback. Feedback, like, rewards are a form of feedback. Consequences are a form of feedback. So, we start looking at how are we going to give kids feedback when they don't meet our expectations, and how we're going to give kids feedback when they do meet our expectations. What I find is schools are oftentimes pretty effective at giving feedback when kids don't meet their expectations. But when they do meet the expectations, we go, well, that's what we should do anyways. As opposed to saying, it just makes good behavioral theory or practice that, of course, you would give reinforcement, And I'm not saying it's all about trips to the treasure box. We have to redefine what reinforcement looks like. Our best reinforcers when I work for the school is a pro-social, no-cost reinforcer. Things like kids getting to eat. Little kids, for example, you go below 6th grade, you get, what little kids want? Most little kids want more than anything else, want more time with adults. You give little guys a choice, like, hey, you can earn lunch with the teacher. Kids lose their mind. They love that. They think it's great. It's special for them, right? When you get above 6th grade, those kids are more likely to want time with peers, like unstructured time with their peers. So we look at that feedback, and then we look at evaluation. So, that's one of those things when people really want to make a thoughtful change and work on things like reducing antisocial strategies, they got to start rethinking how behavior changes. That if it's a skill deficit, then we've got to be a better support system for developing skills for kids.
Yeah, and I like that the 4-step process you said there, but that the one key part there was teaching and then coming back with some feedback. And and I'm glad that I'm an educator because I get to teach kids how to be responsible citizens. And so it's not just about teaching them math; it's about teaching them how to be good people.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, because you and I both know that in the work world, just because you're skilled doesn't mean you're employed. You've got people. If people don't want to be around you, they'll take a little bit less talented person that's easier to work with than a really talented person who is disruptive in the work environment. And the reality of it is, man, we got kids coming in with serious issues. We got kids coming in that are drug exposed. We have kids coming in with a multitude of diagnoses and disabilities. This just whole, kids should know better, and families should make sure that kids. And I think families should be a key partner with us and things like that. But I think schools, we got to have a more thoughtful approach to what our behavior support systems are going to look like, because we're not going to suspend and expel and detention our ways out of the behavioral needs that kids have. It's just not good logic.
Yeah, and I look at every day with some of the behaviors that I see of students around the hallways, and like you just brought up, is that it would be nice if we could work with families, but the reality of it is that some of the kids that are exhibiting the behaviors that are maybe the worst in the school, they probably don't have families, or they probably don't have a mother or father, or they probably don't have anybody at home teaching them those behaviors. And so and that's just kind of the worst behaviors. You want to think about the simple behaviors of just picking up your paper from the desk and putting it in the trash can. Those simple things that nobody's teaching them at home. They're not going to come to school and do it. So somebody has to teach them that in life, and doing it, then we should probably do that at school.
Yeah, I talked about this one thing. I was just saying this today. I was speaking in Beckley, West Virginia today, and I was saying this to folks like, we get too good. We're really good at admiring our problems sometimes. Like we're like look at that, man. And then even like it's a big Appalachian trait for us is to we not only admire our problems, but we have problem competitions with each other. Like, whose problems are worse? Like, oh, well, you had, your kids did this. Well, my kids did this. Or your school has this free and reduced lunch. Well, my school has this free and reduced lunch. It's almost like we sometimes get in this competition of who has it worse, which kind of paralyzes you from a strategy standpoint when you start thinking of, we got to move from admiring problems to solving problems. Like, I had an old football coach who used to say, if you're going to mess up, at least mess up full speed. So I think sometimes we can be spectators of the problems that our kids are dealing with, as opposed to, a true, like a coach for them, like, and really being in it with them. Fans leave when the score gets out of hand, but your coach is still coaching you up through the whole thing. And I think sometimes we have people who are fans of kids, like they're really cheering them on when they got their honors diploma and the cord on there and that kind of stuff. But we got to hang in there with them, even when the score is kind of stacked against us.
Yeah, definitely. I like that analogy.
Yeah, I saw a mentor of mine, Sean Floyd, is where I got that from. He used to talk about cheerleaders and fans and coaches, so that one always stuck with me.
Yeah. So for the last question of the interview here, what's one piece of advice that you would give to a new teacher?
New teacher. Yeah, I was thinking about that one when you sent my. I tell you, I think I have a quote that things are. I give you a quick story about where I'm going to come from with that. My son Jake, who's 11, I played football growing up and played football for a long time in my life, and so Jake said he wanted to play football. So of course I do like the dad thing, and you go outside and you have the dummy and you trying to teach him how to tackle, and and so Jake's like running up, and he's like stutter stepping and like trying to fit his head in there, and he's like kind of tender and grabbing the dummy. And I said, listen, son, if you don't, you're gonna get hurt. If you don't, you gotta want to. Like, I said, tackling is about 40% know-how, but about 60% want to. So you got to want to. You got to get in there, and you got to want to get better. You got to want to get that guy on the ground. And as meathead as that sounds, but I think for me, what our young teacher, what I want from a young teacher, I want they got to have a lot of want to. So you got to tell folks that, like, you have to have a sense of urgency and obsession about getting better. About developing yourself into the highest level professional you can be on a daily basis, because that's quite frankly what students need from us right now. I mean, that's what they've always needed that. But I can remember early in my career, I was promoted to a clinical director sooner than I wasn't ready yet professionally, but the opportunity presented itself and I was in it. And I can just remember a sense of panic in reading. I mean, I was reading everything I could get my hands on. I was listening to audiobooks in the car. It's back when they were cassettes and CDs. And I'm listening to anything I can get my hands on. I'm reading anything I can get my hands on. I've got mentoring relationships. So I think for me, a new teacher, what I want to see from them is that level of enthusiasm. Like, you gotta have a lot of want to. You got to have a lot of want to. I'll give you an example. If they are sitting in a meeting and somebody says something like, oh, well, that student's diagnosed with like ASD level 1, the kind of teacher what they should do in that moment is, if they don't know what ASD level 1 is, then they better be Googling that on the way out of the meeting, because that's what's going to build really competent teachers. So, I think they just need to attack the field with a level of enthusiasm and urgency, because there's, I don't know, I think that's what we need more of, is people who are less pessimistic and less, powerless or whatever, and more like enthusiastic and passionate. Like, listen, I may not know all the answers, but I'm going to work myself to death trying to find a few more today. So I guess I just want people to have a sense of enthusiasm when they're coming into it, So that would be my best advice.
Yeah, that's some pretty good advice. And I know that, just the way that things are nowadays, like, of course we talk about teaching with the internet, teaching with Google, and, all the answers are mostly on Google. It's just, and that's the way it is for teaching, and being an administrator. You could find a lot of resources online. You can find a lot of resources on podcasts, and Twitter. Right. Twitter is a great social networking tool to just keep up and to create that network of people who are similar minded to you, that will also allow you to grow as an educator and grow as a professional.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, and so much of it's free. So much of lack of or access to information is no longer an excuse. I mean, that's just, if I can sit and watch a 2-hour lecture by Robert Sapolsky, who's probably one of the leading researchers in human stress, if I can watch 2 hours of him lecturing at Stanford for free on YouTube, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I think we take some of that for granted. I mean, like, I just think there's access to so much information that'll help us be better professionals. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, and even like what you and I are doing right now, the conversation we're having, we're both going to walk out of this conversation just a little bit sharper, because both of us have had to think a little deeper about what students need from us. That's why I'm glad that you're doing this podcast, is because I think people need to participate in these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of it is I want to grow as an educator and a professional too. That's part of the reason why I'm doing this is just so that I can learn. But, I just see so much more that could be done differently, and just having conversations with you and some of the others that we'll have on, I think will just open that dialogue. So that way, it's not just me having that conversation with you. It's us having that conversation and sharing it out with the entire world. And then maybe that sparks an idea, or maybe that sparks some motivation for, a couple others, or who knows how many others. And that can lead to some change.
Right. Yeah. I was just talking. I was in Cincinnati yesterday. Actually just north of Cincinnati in Fairfield. And I was telling people, the first thing I started out with the talk was like, listen, gang, let's get this right out of the way. I'm a profoundly flawed human being. There may be other people in this room that are flawed too, but let me come right out of the gate and tell you, there's times when I know better and I do better. There's times when I know better and I don't do better. But I think I'm committed to a worthy struggle. I believe that we need to continue to learn, continue to support kids. And I find that sometimes that these kind of conversations, they rejuvenate you. You know what I mean? They get you thinking, like, because, one of my favorite things to talk about is from Sean Achor is being a rational optimist. And what he says by that is rational optimists just has to believe that their behavior matters. That's it. They don't have to believe they can fix things. They don't have to believe that they have miracles. They just have to believe. It's kind of like that Dumb and Dumber thing. So you're saying there's a chance, right? So it's that rational optimist is the person who's saying, like, you know what? I may not be able to fix this kid's life, but I'm going to be better. What'll make that kid's day a little bit better. And I think that's a more rational expectation for what we're doing. So, and conversations like we're having today, what I want people to do is just ask better questions, look for better answers, because I surely don't have all the answers. But I feel like I'm participating in a conversation that we need to be having right now in education.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I do appreciate your time this evening. If somebody's interested in getting a hold of you, what's the best way to contact you?
Probably the easiest way would be I'm on social media. I'm through social media. If you go on Facebook, it's Jim Harris OCS. On Twitter, it's Jim Harris OCS. I'm getting ready to. I'm going to submit and jump into Instagram here in the not so distant future. And also my email, a good way to track is jimharris.ocs@me.com. My website is ocshelps.com. So I think get me all those ways. I'm working on some different projects now, so I'm hopefully going to have some stuff out for some folks coming up. Paul, you motivated me. Now I had some episodes back in the day, and now I got to break out. I think podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time in the car, and I watch stuff all the time. So I'm going to break out some of that. So I might have to circle back around and ask you to return the favor on being a guest for me. So we can look, and I do have some stuff on YouTube as well, but, and then also I'm in the process of getting the book, 10 Things You Need to Know About Kids, completed. I'm in the writing process of that. So hopefully folks will have that to look into. It'll be completed in 2019.
Well, good. Yeah, I know. I've heard the CD you have for the
yeah.
And it's some pretty good stuff. So I bet you the book's going to be even better.
I'm working on it, man. That's something. It's hard. It's hard. It's fun, but it's like I said, there's no easy way around it. Only through it. So
yeah. Well, I appreciate your time this evening, and thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it, man.